I wanted to share some thoughts on a news article I saw the other day, and as it happens with so many of these things, there's a confluence of information leading to some conclusions that I'm not sure are the most obvious to most people. So I just want to highlight them here. The headline reads, Grocery Rationing Within 4 Years. Now, this is an article by Jeffrey Tucker, who's with the Brownstone Institute, and he used to be with the Mises Institute. I'm not sure if he is still, but I know years and years ago he was. Anyway, this guy's been around. He's bright. He knows what he's talking about, and his focus is economics. He is a libertarian-oriented free market economist, so that certainly, I don't want to say it flavors his thinking, but it accurately predicts the sorts of things he's going to say. But this article is really well written, unsurprisingly. Okay, so let's get to his point first, which is the headline. We'll get to the details in a minute. The focus that he has is on what is likely to happen if Kamala Harris is elected. I agree completely with his methodology here, his reasons for his conclusion. But I'd like to suggest that no matter which candidate gets elected, we will very likely be facing grocery rationing within 4 years. And it is as certain as it gets that we will face drastic price increases in groceries in the next 4 years. So if you think that the inflation that we've seen so far was bad, I have very bad news. It's going to get a lot worse. And we'll talk about why. We'll use his reasons, which apply for Kamala's election. And even if Trump gets elected instead, we will see many of the same outcomes, and I'll tell you why. Okay, so let's cruise through this. I'm not going to read it to you. But his first point is, anytime you have price controls, that they always lead to shortages of whatever is controlled. Okay? Now you can Google that to your heart's content as to why, but essentially, if you cap the price, you cap supply, because people will choose not to make something that they can't make money on, or they can't make enough money on to make it worthwhile to them. And so when the price controls come in, the supply reduces, and it increases, it increases the black market price, but it decreases the supply. And so there are shortages. Okay? Now, and the second point he makes is this is not experimental. It's been tried a bunch of times. It's been tried in the United States in 1941. And guess what happened? There were shortages. All right? Now, the pattern is, in order to force people to comply, they charge an enormous fine. In those days, if you do the modern equivalents, it was $200,000 in our current dollars if you broke the law. But it didn't work. There were still black markets all over the place. Now let me ask you this: if the supply is already short, because people say, well, let's say a farmer says, well, I'm not going to grow that crop this year because there are price controls. Or if you are talking about price controls with housing, the landlord says, well, I'm not even going to bother renting my place. It's not worth the trouble for what I can get in rent. You further reduce the supply because of the black market. So the existing supply will be further reduced because some of that will be offloaded to the black market because the incentive is so high. You can charge so much more, right? Okay, so there was rationing and it went very badly. Now, next point he makes is that it would be even easier to do that today. Why? Because of food stamps. The system is already in place where they could roll out an extension of food stamps. And if they did this, for example, they could make it illegal to buy food except through government programs, and then they're tracking what everyone's purchasing. Anyway, however the details work out, this is something that Harris has repeatedly supported, and it's likely to occur. Okay? So, that's that. Now, flipping over to what if Trump gets elected? Well, the details will be different, but the outcomes will be very similar. Why? Well, here's just one reason. It's not everything. We're not going over everything here. But you can find a lot of resources from about to tell you, but unfortunately, almost all of them are videos. And I don't want to take the time to transcribe these and show you this trend. But I did find this obviously pointed article, RFK Jr.'s plan to weaponize regulators to transform American agriculture. So recently, Bobby Kennedy Jr. joined forces with Trump. Trump is going to put him into some position on the cabinet, and that will probably have something to do with oversight of food and or drugs. And here's the thing on both counts. RFK Jr. has some very good points in many topics, on many topics. He has some atrociously bad points in each of those topics as well. So one of his really, really bad limitations is that he doesn't understand how much the modern food supply relies on chemicals or processes that one could easily make the case are less than perfect. I'll put it that way. It's amazing, but not surprising, that there are people out there who are obviously intelligent. RFK Jr. is very smart in some ways, but he's really dumb in others. And what I mean by that is a person of this intelligence really shouldn't be making the mistakes that he does in his policies. Okay? Now, I'm not picking on him. There are many people like this. Trump's like this. There are many people like this. Okay? It's a very common problem. And I could get to the root of why that is, but it's outside the scope of this. The point is, if you suddenly make something our current system is absolutely reliant on illegal, there will be drastic, vast consequences that extend beyond what the people making it illegal and the people supporting making it illegal expect. Why? Because they're complex systems. People don't understand complex systems. Small changes create enormous consequences in complex systems. The more complex the system is, the higher the likelihood that any little change is going to have an enormous consequence, and the higher the likelihood that you can't accurately predict it. It's like playing with a nuclear launch button. Okay? It's not something you want to do. The problem is that all of these analyses, they zoom in real close to the question at hand, like, is glyphosate dangerous? That's a simple question. That's not a complex question. So suppose there's overwhelming evidence that it is. The issue is, if you look at that in isolation, you're going to come to conclusions that cause much greater harm than benefit. A common example of this is the people that fixate on carbon dioxide from burning coal for energy. You can't decide the benefit of that situation by isolating the question of whether it causes pollution or not. That's way too narrow, okay? So as you look at things like chemicals in our food supply, the problem is, whether that be in growing it, packaging it, shipping it, or, I said packaging, yeah, wherever it is in the ecosystem. So the secondary or other downstream effects can be enormous when you change these things. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't be changed. It doesn't mean that what we've got is the best it could be. But you don't just go into a very sophisticated machine and say, I don't like this one gear, I'm going to yank it out. The current system depends on ultra inexpensive food. You cannot produce the quantity of food that we do using, quote, organic regenerative agriculture. The way you do it, which I agree is ideal, is you shift it back to small family farms, and the result is what modern people will regard as devastating poverty. It would be the 1920s. Okay? But the cascading effect of that is a massive positive over what we have today. It would be better, taken broadly. But it absolutely will look nothing like anything people have today. And if you try to make, first off, if you try to replace what we have with something else, not small family farms, but no, let's keep going with the just-in-time. New food comes to the grocery store every day. People buy a couple days worth of groceries, and this is what they do. You can't keep doing that in any other way. And the closest thing to that, what it looks like, is atrociously expensive food. 10 times or more as expensive as what we have right now. Now, I'm just throwing out that number. Don't quote me on it. But it's a big enough shift that massive numbers of people would absolutely go hungry. And the only way to feed them, and before we even get to starvation, there would be holes in the grocery shelves all the time. All the time. The only way to feed the people who would otherwise starve is going to be through inordinate taxes, new taxes, or deficit spending, wherever they get the money, that expand things like food stamps. And so we've already seen that happen in the preceding years. Enormous expansions to the number of people on food stamps, and huge expansions to how much money they get. That would just get worse and worse and worse on this. And that is not a good thing. Okay? A very similar thing to this happened recently by the same sorts of people for the same sorts of reasons in the pharmaceutical industry, where there's a constant pressure for the United States to adopt regulations coming out of the EU. And the EU is typically a lot more restrictive than we are on pretty much everything. But the EU decided to roll out a new regulation that would prohibit the use of, I believe it was propylene glycol. And I actually had a pretty good lens on this because of some people I knew well who were involved in preparing the rebuttal to, whether it was the EU or the FDA, I don't remember. But in short, it would essentially make it impossible to produce any of the drugs that people use. And that's a very summarized argument, but essentially the people pushing the change had absolutely no clue how reliant the current system is on the way things are. And the drug companies, who obviously are not saints, they pushed back with the offer to approach this, but the request for much more time to do it in the timeframes offered were just impossible. It would grind everything to a halt. And so that's the issue, is when you have bureaucrats making these decisions, they're at best, they're looking at information in a very narrow way. And this is always the problem with centrally controlled government, is that invariably you're going to have people making enormous decisions who lack the information or wisdom to do so. And I'm telling you right now, one way or another, we're going to see shortages at the grocery store in the next 4 years. It's highly, highly likely. And even if there aren't, you're going to see the prices go through the roof because there are so many changes in play that would result in that the odds are overwhelmingly in favor of drastic increases to grocery prices. Now, to transition this and drive home an even more important point, I've had discussions with one friend of mine who's into homesteading for years, where one of us would ask the question, why would anyone do this? Because it costs so much money compared to just buying it from the store. I mean, if you wanted to get a property to the point where, and this is just to point this out in case you don't know, I hope you know, but most people don't, homesteading is not about growing vegetables. Vegetables are about nutrition, not calories. And most people don't know the difference. Vegetables provide vitamins and minerals, but they don't provide, they provide negligible calories. In order to provide calories on a farm, you're talking about grain or meat, and animals eat grain. So either way, you're talking about grain. Very few introductory homesteaders think about this. You're not going to see normal people experimenting with ways to grow or harvest grain. But that is the staple. It's the foundation of everything else, if you're serious. So, it turns out that it's not an easy thing to figure out. And people look at this and they say, why on earth would you spend the time and money to figure out how to grow grain at scale, but at a small scale? So to grow a subsistence amount of grain on a small farm. It's not something anyone does today. Everyone used to do it before about 1940. But you can look at graphs of this. Since then, no one does it, to the point where you can't even buy the machine to hook to a small tractor to harvest and process grain. It's called a combine. They used to have them small enough that you could attach them to a reasonably sized tractor. And it would cut the grain, it would beat the grain, and separate the actual seed from the chaff. They went out of production in the 60s because all of the farms were exploding in size. They were combining, and that's ironic, but the combining farms meant the cessation of the small combine. And so now every sack of grain that you buy at the store, all the flour you buy at the store, it was all harvested on a full-size combine, a standalone machine, and those can easily cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're enormous machines. And you think these are only used during harvest season. So you have to have at least 1,000 acres for even a used one to make sense. A very much used one, a very old broken down one. So, when it comes to homesteading, this is just, I gave you some specific details there, but it's an extraordinarily expensive enterprise to figure out things that have been long forgotten and also to solve problems that are really hard to solve. How do you farm economically at a small scale? Because, like I said, in the 1920s, everyone was doing it largely with knowledge that's been lost. But, and it's local knowledge. It's very specific to your climate, soil, etc. And locally adapted varieties of vegetables and plants, trees, fruit trees, etc. But more than that, how do you do this in a way where you aren't extremely poor in doing so? Because modern people would not tolerate 1920s subsistence farming incomes, because there is no income. I mean, barefoot on dirt floors, right? And your clothes are made out of the sacks that the flour comes in. So, and the houses are tiny, and there's no HVAC. You'd be lucky if there's running water. You probably have an outhouse. So it's quite a puzzle to solve that. And what my friend always says is that no sane person would do this because they'd be doing it for all the wrong reasons. And the point I wanted to make was all of those reasons are changing. And I'm not even sure if you're noticing. See, it used to be pretty silly to say something like, I want to get to the point where we don't have to buy green beans in the grocery store anymore. We produce all the green beans that we're going to eat, we grow ourselves. And we freeze them or can them. Well, when green beans are $5 a pound or whatever insane price, it's not so crazy anymore. And eventually you get to the point where normal people can't afford green beans. And then the only people that have them are the ones who solved the problem, who moved to a place, figured out what varieties worked there. So they took advantage of the fact that we have a luxurious access to seed catalogs and all these different varieties, and you can plant them all and see which one does the best. And it takes years to figure out. And those seeds aren't cheap. And the place to grow them, that takes a lot of work to prep soil and water it and everything else. Weed it. And we're just talking about green beans. What about beef? I'm telling you right now, there is going to be a time where normal people can no longer afford it. It's the case already for a lot of people. And they just eat chicken now and pork. I'm telling you right now, there will be a time when normal people cannot afford meat at all. And the only people that will eat it are the very wealthy and people living on farms. This is not some crazy idea. The writing is already on the wall. And if you were more informed and honest, and maybe a little more capable of reasoning, I'm trying to say this in a way that's not disparaging. If you're more intelligent, I'll just say it, and honest and informed, you would see this clear as day. Oh, Rob just said anyone who disagrees with him is uninformed or stupid or dishonest. Prove me now herewith if I'm wrong. Give me the evidence that you're relying on to believe that I'm incorrect in saying that on this thing. But in general, on anything, please show me my mistake. Show me where my math doesn't add up. Because 9 times out of 10, it's just that if you think this is extreme, it's just because it makes you uncomfortable. It has nothing to do with the facts. It has nothing to do with the strength of the argument. It has everything to do with you being unwilling to consider certain things and being uncomfortable with certain ideas. So bring your reasons if you've got them. And I will be the happiest person in the world if you can show me something better. Short of that, I'm telling you right now, there's going to be grocery rationing, shortages, vastly increased prices. Certain foods are going to get so expensive that you will absolutely stop buying them. Again, it's already true. The easiest predictions to make are the ones that are already true. The question is just how bad is it going to get? And I just told you, it's going to get bad enough that you're going to stop eating meat unless you're growing the animals yourself, raising them yourself. That's going to happen. You're going to see it happen, and then you're going to forget we had this conversation because that's always what people do. You're not going to come back and say, wow, how did you know that years before it happened? I hope it's years. You're just going to forget, and everyone will pretend like they already knew that, and they always did. But for the humble, be prepared, because it's going to happen. And the purpose of this, God's purpose in making things harder, as the end times roll forward is so that you are more willing to learn and live the way he would in your place. To appraise things that have great value with great value. Even now, you are living better. If you live in the United States, it doesn't matter how poor you are. If you live in the United States, you live better than most kings ever did. Kings and queens. And what are you using it for? You're using the fact that you can open up the freezer. Just this morning, I had a luxurious breakfast. Okay? Luxurious breakfast. And I've been doing that the last few days, and I eat pretty Spartan the rest of the day, and it just works out better for my productivity. You can open up the freezer, pop out your air fryer, fry up some scrambled eggs. You got frozen tater tots, frozen sausage patties, which I'm eating because someone forgot them in the back of the freezer and now they're questionable. But you put it all in the air fryer. In 10 minutes, you've got this breakfast that's better than most people have eaten in their whole lives through history. Are you any better of a person because of that convenience or that multitude of calories and nutrition? I'm trying to get my sausage patties in before RFK takes them away. Or Kamala, whatever, whoever does it, doesn't matter. Okay? But how are we living differently because of it? I can tell you what I did differently because of it. But what are you doing differently because of it? Are you a healthier person? Are you a happier person? Are you a more productive person? Do you do more good in the world than some peat moss bog peasant did 300 years ago? Because you probably aren't. If you're in any way normal, you aren't any better than that. You're probably worse than that person as far as the good that you do in your life. And getting slightly off topic, because of the bait and switch off of those bitter, impoverished family farms, quote unquote, back in the 1920s, everyone moved to cities. That peat bog peasant, that's a really hard thing to say quickly, probably lived in a nicer house than you do. Although they didn't have running water or climate control. You can look at pictures of these people's houses. I just saw this morning, since we're on the topic, I saw a picture of 3 houses from the 1890s, I believe, in Los Angeles. They were large, handcrafted, beautiful houses. The one was owned by a carpenter. The second was owned by, I don't remember, it was another trade. The third was owned by just a normal middle-class family. Today, they would be seen almost as castles. People doing those professions could absolutely, or in that economic status, could absolutely not afford anything like that. It was a bait and switch. And so all these changes are a reversion back to the way it's always been. And it is going to be rough because getting here took generations, and it's all going to be taken away in one, and you're it. You're going to see these things happen unless you die first. But the people alive today are going to see this collapse. It's a big deal. And again, it's the easiest prediction to make in the world. It's already happening. So I hope that this helps you change your incentives to make decisions that you previously saw as not worth the cost. I don't want to grow green beans. I can just buy a bag of them for $1. Not anymore, you can't. And it's going to get a lot worse.